Hello and welcome. I am Ellie Richardson and you are watching the World Report on NewsX World. We are going to start this with some breaking news. The US and Iran agreed to hold talks in Oman on Friday despite sharp differences over the scope of negotiations. Washington seeks to include Iran's missile program, while Tehran says only its nuclear file is on the table. China's leader Xi Jinping has called Taiwan the most important issue in China-US relations during a phone call with US President Donald Trump. Xi told Trump to be prudent when supplying weapons to the island, state media reports. Putin's envoy Kirill Dmitriev says talks on Ukraine peace deal show progress and positive momentum after negotiations in Abu Dhabi. He accuses Europe and Britain of trying to interfere with the process. Ukraine's energy minister warns power cuts could intensify in the coming days. He says Russia may launch new air attacks on power and heating networks. Pakistan's military says at least 216 militants are killed in operation in Balochistan province. Authorities say the security operation has now ended. A legal rights group says Venezuela frees 22 more prisoners. The releases come as interim government promises slowly continue. Gaza health officials say Israeli tank shelling and airstrikes killed 24 Palestinians, including 7 children. The dead includes a medic killed while responding to an airstrike in Khan Yunis. Nigeria's President Bola Ahmed Tinubu deploys an army to Kwara State after gunmen killed as many as 162 people in one of the country's deadliest attacks in recent months. Babamo Ayodeji, Kwara State Secretary, has said the search for the more bodies continue. And for some breaking news, the Pentagon and the US European Command have announced the re-establishment of high-level military-to-military dialogue between the US and Russia, following a series of meetings in the UAE after senior Russian and Ukrainian militant officials. The discussions mark a significant step towards improving communication between the two military powers amid ongoing tensions over the war in Ukraine. Both parties agreed to continue direct military talks to ensure stability and prevent potential escalation. We are now being joined by Dan Perry, an international affairs expert in Tel Aviv. Thank you so much for joining us here today. With this breaking news, what practical benefits can come from rebuilding direct military communication between the US and Russia, especially during ongoing conflict?
Well, it could prevent misunderstandings that could lead to the outbreak of World War III. So communications even between enemy countries is probably a good thing. The risk is that this will be seen by Russia as another step by the United States to project subtly, or maybe not so subtly, that they don't mind Russia so much. And that Russia is meant to be invited back into the fold and maybe back into the G7. Trump famously understates the degree to which Russia is the aggressor in this war, and he's flirted with suggesting that Ukraine started it. He's called Zelensky a dictator, which is false, ignoring the fact that Putin is. So steps that see the US coming closer to Russia, both in real terms, but especially in messaging terms and political implications, I think will be viewed somewhat askance by the democratic free world that the Americans are supposed to be leading, but to which they appear increasingly indifferent.
Yeah, exactly. And how might renewed military dialogue help reduce the risk of accidental escalation or misunderstanding between two nuclear-armed powers?
Well, the fear throughout the Cold War between the West, led by the U.S., and the predecessor nation to Russia, the Soviet Union, was that something could happen by mistake, and then that would trigger a response, and then that would trigger a response, and pretty soon you have a massive nuclear exchange. This is why communication is very, very important. And sometimes that communication can be done and has taken the form of public diplomacy. When the United States discovered missiles being located in Cuba by the Soviet Union in the early 60s, President Kennedy delivered a very public rebuke and threat, and the Soviet Union backed down. So various channels of communication are always helpful. The overall picture here is that the world has an interest in projecting to Russia that the war in Ukraine must end. And I am wondering, and I do not know, whether this communication includes uh, direct discussion on winding down the war. And that, of course, is a larger political issue and attaches to ongoing talks between Ukraine and Russia in in the Gulf and elsewhere.
And could re-establishing a military channel between between Washington and Moscow reshape global stability beyond the Ukraine conflict?
Yeah, I mean, Russia is seen by the Europeans in particular as a major threat, and the fear has been that if they get what they want too much in Ukraine, that might whet their appetite to try to do similar moves in the Baltics and maybe even threaten parts of Western Europe. The Germans in particular feel threatened, and of course, Russia is interfering in all these countries with digital machinations on a political front, trying to help far right parties that might create fissions and divisions and maybe even breakups in the European Union to weaken Europe. All this is part of the edifice, and the discussions with Russia, military talks with Russia, in broader geopolitics, as you suggest, certainly have an impact. But it could go one of two ways. It could either have the effect of taming Russia and making them feel like they're being listened to, and their interests are being taken into account. For example, famously and especially, no further expansion of NATO uh, versus the opposite. It could make them feel like their rogue criminal actions in Ukraine have gone unpunished, and that really is the danger. And of course, we talk about potential intelligence sharing between the U.S. and Russia. The big question is whether this will come at the expense of intelligence sharing with Ukraine, where the United States, after having basically withdrawn its financial support for Ukraine. That's the main irreplaceable function that the U.S. currently serves in that war. There's no doubt that Russia will use these military channels with the U.S. to try to, undermine even that and to remove the U.S. entirely from relevance in the Ukraine arena. And that relevance still exists, albeit somewhat transactionalist. Basically, the U.S. sells weapons to the Europeans who buy it, and then via channels in NATO, transmit those weapons to Ukraine.
Thank you, Dan. Don't go too far, as we will be coming back to you very shortly. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says the next round of talks with Russia will take place in Abu Dhabi in the near future, following what Ukrainian officials describe as really constructive discussions. Kyiv confirms the latest US brokered talks have now ended, with Ukraine pushing strongly for further prisoners of war swaps. This comes as, in a major breakthrough, the United States, Ukraine and Russia have agreed to exchange 314 prisoners, the first such swap in 5 months. US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff says the agreement shows diplomacy is delivering results even as fighting continues on the ground. Russia's defense ministry says it has already received 157 servicemen and 3 civilians, while Ukraine has taken back 157 prisoners of war. The freed Russian soldiers are now in Belarus receiving medical care. Zelensky also says Ukraine is ready to swap drones for air defense missiles and MiG fighter jets as talks move forward. We are now being joined by Dan again. Thank you for joining us back. So as this breakthrough has come through about their talks, the Ukrainian delegation described the talks as really constructive. What concrete signs of progress should we look for in these negotiations? Obviously, we've heard that they're exchanging prisoners, but what more will we see, do you think?
Well, I would have hoped for a ceasefire and an explicit agreement by Russia to stop bombarding Ukrainian energy infrastructure for the express purpose of causing Ukrainian civilians to freeze to death in their very harsh winter. As far as we know, Russia has not backed down a whit from its demands, not only that Ukraine cede territory that Russia has occupied to date, but also further territory in the 4 regions that Russia illegally annexed, that they haven't been able to occupy, and where they've been held at bay by Ukraine's a string of fortress cities that really do harm the Russians' ability to move forward. And none of that has happened. I'm a little bit underwhelmed by this prisoner agreement. I mean, it's great for the under 400 prisoners of equal number on each side that were swapped or will be swapped. But I mean, Ukraine is getting back under 200 people. We believe over 4,000 are being held by Russia, possibly many, many more. And that doesn't include civilians in the areas Russia has occupied that are being killed, arrested, and abused in every way. Russia shows no sign of ending its criminal action in Ukraine. Obviously, the Americans, by restoring relations in various ways with Russia and projecting to the Russians that they're still welcome in the fold, despite this happening, risk sending the wrong message and encouraging Russia to continue. So it's possible that things were agreed in the talks that have not been made public. But if one is to judge by what has been made public, I see no particular progress towards anything that could lead to an end to the war. And if anything, we saw this week Xi Jinping and Putin, deepening their ties, having this talk, signing alliances with Iran, basically projecting to Russia that China will continue to enable its aggression in Ukraine to continue as it buys about half of Russia's oil and greases the wheels of Russia's war machine.
And you just touched on it there, but obviously we've heard about both sides agreeing to a 314-person prisoner swap, but we haven't heard anything about a ceasefire for now. Given that conflict is still happening in both countries, as talks proceed with Russia attacking Ukraine still, how should negotiators balance immediate tactile gains like prisoner swapping with the long-term strategic goals of ending the war and securing Ukraine's territorial integrity?
The immediate tactile gains should be seen as a bridge to the overall strategic goal, which is not only to end the war, but to the degree possible to restore Ukraine's territorial integrity, to allow Ukraine a fast track to the European Union, to allow Ukraine to provide Ukraine security guarantees against any further aggression that would be equivalent to NATO membership without constituting NATO membership, because I think that is off the table. And in general, to act in a manner that doesn't reward Russia such that it might encourage belligerence elsewhere, for example, by China and Taiwan, where just this month, just this week, we hear further bellicose comments from Xi Jinping. Of course, instead of doing any of that, the U.S. administration appears to be justifying aggression towards vulnerable neighbors and allies with its posture towards Greenland and Denmark, which hopefully they stood down from, but we may not have seen the last of that.
Thank you, Dan. Don't go too far, as we will be with you again very shortly. Unredacted images and videos containing nudity and identifying details of Epstein's victims have been circulating online, causing significant harm despite warnings to US officials. Lawyers representing the victims have expressed outrage over the failure to redact sensitive information, calling the damage irreplaceable. The Department of Justice has removed some documents from its website after discovering the redaction failures, but independent investigations revealed that several images remain accessible. Victims and their legal representatives are heartbroken, calling the breach a severe violation of privacy. The Department of Justice has pledged to continue reviewing and redacting files, but the exposure of the sensitive materials continues to cause distress among the survivors. We are now being joined again by Dan Perry. Thank you for joining us back for this. How did explicit images remain in the Epstein files despite public outcry? And what does this say about how carefully sensitive material was handled?
This issue is perplexing and disturbing from top to bottom. There's a meta question of how any of this could possibly have happened, and how so many people from all political backgrounds that are senior and important in the U.S. were so mixed up with Epstein and his disgraceful enterprise. It boggles the mind. Now we have the Transparency Act calling for the publishing of all the files involved. We believe that's over 6 million. It would appear to be an exercise in incompetence. How you ask, how could it be that hundreds of images of victims were released? I mean, they're calling it human error. Could it possibly be? Are they not paying attention? It's not so difficult to think of the Trump Department of Justice as irredeemably stupid, but on the other hand, we see they were very, very, very careful in redacting all over the place, and thousands of documents, huge amounts of information that would perhaps harm the privacy of people who are not the victims, or rather are implicated in all this. And one can more than suspect that these very careful reductions are part of an effort to protect politicians who are very powerful today. And I think everyone knows what I mean. How could it be then that when they were so careful to protect Trump and his cronies, they were so careless about publishing images of these women is truly a mystery. But I suppose if you look at the incoherence of much of what happens in a Trump administration, the mystery is clarified somewhat.
And who should be held responsible when transparency efforts end up harming victims instead of protecting them?
Well, I would expect the government and the Department of Justice to be sued, and I would expect the courts to rule quickly on this matter. Obviously, there is reason to redact documents in cases where innocent people's privacy is harmed. I think you could argue, I'm no legal expert, but I think you could argue that these women have been grievously harmed, and I would expect them to sue for damages, and that would presumably be directed at the Department of Justice. And who knows, maybe Pam Bondi herself and her adjutants.
Thank you very much, Dan, for joining us here on NewsX World. India and the United States expect to sign a formal trade deal in March in a move aimed at deepening economic ties between the two countries. Indian Trade Minister Piyush Goyal has said that India and the US expect to sign a formal trade deal in March, after which New Delhi will lower tariffs on US goods. Goyal added that the two countries will issue a joint statement within 4 or 5 days, after which Washington will cut duties on Indian exports to 18% from 50%. India, in turn, will buy about $500 billion worth of US goods over the next 5 years, including $70 to $80 billion of Boeing aircrafts. According to reports, the deal, which was announced by the US President Donald Trump, slashed US tariffs on Indian goods in exchange for New Delhi stopping Russian oil purchases, bringing down tariffs and purchasing $500 billion worth of American goods. We are now being joined by Ambassador Bishwati Mukherjee, who's a former Indian ambassador, joining us from New Delhi. Thank you so much for joining us here today on NewsX World. Why are India and the United States choosing to sign a trade deal now, and what does it mean for their relationship?
The trade deal was ready for the last 3 months, but President Trump delayed signing it in order to put additional pressure on India. However, that additional pressure did not work because he wanted us to open up our vulnerable agricultural sector and to also accept genetically modified products which are not permitted in India under Indian law. So when that did not work, but on the other hand, it became clear to President Trump and his inner circle that we are looking for expanding our markets. We've signed an FTA with Australia, with New Zealand, with UK, and now with the European Union, so as to ensure that whatever losses we've taken with the 50% tariffs very unfairly imposed upon us on the charge of buying Russian oil, when nothing was done, when China is buying double the amount, and the Europeans in different ways are buying many other Russian products. But at any point, I think the realization also dawned that India is a very important strategic partner of the United States and the bulwark of Western interests for a rule-based order in the Indo-Pacific. And all these measures were slowly and surely driving India away from the United States through bullying and through pressure tactics. Under those circumstances, the deal is ready. It will be signed in 3 months' time. There will be a joint statement. We have never confirmed that we are not going to buy Russian oil. We have said we are ready to buy the Venezuelan oil, which is heavy oil like Russian oil, for which we have Indian refineries in Jamnagar, etc., which can refine that oil. This Venezuelan oil is important for Trump because he wants to use some of the profits to plow back to Venezuela to make Venezuela investable from an American business perspective, since most American CEOs have said that right now Venezuela is uninvestable as far as oil exploitation is concerned. That is why it was important. But we have never confirmed that we are not going to buy Russian oil. And the moment that there is a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, this question in any case will be redundant because the sanctions on Russian entities will be removed. So anybody is free to buy anything they like from anywhere. What is important for the Americans is that we have agreed to a huge defense deal, and we have agreed to significant concessions, keeping in mind that we are a country of 1.4 billion people. It's a huge market for the United States for some of their products. But we have never agreed that we will destroy our agricultural and dairy farming institute or introduce non-vegetarian, genetically modified food for our poultry and our animals, because this is a very sensitive issue. Most Indians are vegetarian, and genetically modified food is not allowed in India under law. All these have been taken into account. So one should discount some of the public statements being made unilaterally by the American side and listen to public statements which are jointly made by both sides to give you a clear idea of what exactly the deal is all about.
Thank you, Bishwati, for joining us, but don't go too far as we will be back with you shortly. Democratic US Senate have urged Pentagon to conduct an immediate review of SpaceX amid allegations that Chinese investors have secretly acquired stakes in the closely held rocket maker, citing the potential national security risks. Senators Elizabeth Warren and Andy Kim have urged the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, expressing concern that Chinese investment in SpaceX could present a national security threat, potentially jeopardizing key military intelligence and civilian infrastructure. According to reports, court testimonies have been suggesting that investors with ties to China routed funds through entities in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands to mask purchases of SpaceX shares. We are now being joined again by Ambassador Bhaswati. Thank you for joining us back here on NewsX World. How should the US balance allowing foreign investments in companies like SpaceX with protecting national security?
Well, it is a very delicate balancing act, considering that China is considered to be the principal adversary of the United States, both economically and militarily. And most of the measures that President Trump has taken has been to checkmate the rise of China. So under those circumstances, it is very difficult to understand why the Americans should want China to invest in SpaceX. It just goes to show that there are many technological issues on which clearly the Chinese are equal or ahead of the Americans, and therefore they have to depend on them. So the whole question of the global hegemony of one power, that's the United States, is being increasingly challenged by the Chinese. That is something which American policymakers should think about. Should they let in the Chinese into some of the most sensitive parts of American technology, or should they look at other allies who are much more dependable, reliable, long-term allies who have the joint interest of their country and the United States in mind? That is for American policymakers to decide. But certainly, it's a mystifying decision that on one hand, you're trying to checkmate China and keep it out, and on the other hand, you're letting them in to your most sensitive space technology. For me, it looks like a strategic conundrum for the Americans. They need to work out how best to do it. In my perspective, it is a contradiction in terms in their foreign policy. What do they want? Do they want China to grow stronger than the United States, or do they want to checkmate China? That's something that the Americans have to think about.
Thank you, Bhaswati, for joining us here today on NewsX World. The 2026 Winter Olympics, called the Milano Cortina Games, will be held in northern Italy from February the 6th to the 22nd, with a few events kicking off earlier. The game is led by Milan and Cortina d'Ampezzo as the main host this year. It follows diverse venues, with competitors taking place across several locations. The Olympic Council of Asia announced that the next Asian Winter Games will be held in the Kazakhstan city of Almaty in 2029. The event was due in Saudi Arabia but was prorogued last month. Kazakhstan has hosted the event before in 2011, with Almaty and Astana serving as host cities. Almaty had also bid to host the 2022 Winter Olympics, but ultimately lost to Beijing. That's all we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from around the world.